you. Thank you, Manira. Thank you, Nitin. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to be back in Tamil Nadu yet again, and indeed back in Chennai yet again. I'm reminded I must update my CV. It's getting a bit out of date. I was given a choice of what I could talk to you about today, and I went for a more fundamental topic. But as you'll see as I go through, this has huge ramification and meaning for diabetes therapies. So although this is addressing the basis of the disease we're all involved in treating and looking after, it has marked consequences for drug development, which is my major interest these days. And in that sense, I do have dualities of interest, and they're basically with all the insulin manufacturers and nearly all of the oral agent and GLP-1 manufacturers. So if I mention an agent, bear that in mind, please. So a nice cold slide, and indeed we go back a little bit in history to think about what we understand and the way we usually talk about type 2 diabetes. This is from De Fronzo's famous lecture back in 1988. And look at the top panel here. The green line is often how we think of diabetes developing. That is from normal people, controls up at the top here, through people who are merely obese, developing some insulin insensitivity or insulin resistance, and then diabetes and glucose intolerance developing only really here as you begin to fade with your insulin secretion. So insulin resistance, insulin insensitivity at the basis of this, and then with the failure of compensatory insulin secretion, the development of glucose intolerance and worsening to diabetes and thereafter. And that's the normal way you will see diabetes described in virtually any paper on the pathogenesis of diabetes. Fronzo also looked at the origin of that and pointed out, and this is held with time, that the fundamental defect here probably is in the liver. That is, that glucose output, excess glucose into the circulation in the fasting state is the major problem, and correlates, of course, with the glucose concentration, the fasting plasma glucose in the fasting state as well. It's not often as well understood, however, that that's also true about the fed state. The major reason that glucose levels go up, of course, is that glucose is delivered into the circulation in the fed state from the gut. But what happens is that that fails to suppress at the liver. So normal people, when you eat, you actually suppress your glucose production from the liver. In people with type 2 diabetes, you do not suppress that glucose production, and it's the difference between these lines which actually gives rise to the hyperglycemia after meals, or should I say the excess hyperglycemia after meals. So the liver really is central to why we get hyperglycemia in type 2 diabetes, both in the fasting state and in the fed state. And when I'm talking in Newcastle and describing drugs, I put that in these terms in pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes. We recognize lack of exercise, high-calorie diet, giving rise to insulin resistance. So some people, interestingly, don't become insulin resistant, and that, of course, relates to genetic factors, and I'm not going to go into it now, but essentially as to where you put the excess fat. Do you put it centrally around the liver, in which case you become insulin resistant, or peripherally, in which case you don't? And then, as we've said, there's the failure to compensate for that, the decrease in insulin secretion due to progressive pancreatic damage, and again, genetic factors influence how quickly that occurs. Both together, of course, giving a rise in blood glucose, and blood glucose itself, not a topic for today, being glucose toxic and worsening both these things. So this is our conventional view now of the pathogenesis of type 2 diabetes, and indeed it's a useful one when we come to try and talk and understand it, but probably it's wrong. What then might we mean by the terms insulin resistance? After all, insulin is not a force, it's not a load. The body doesn't resist insulin, it responds to it. It's rather a signal which modulates effective pathways. And really the term insulin insensitivity, it was always better terminology. But even this may be misleading as a mechanism. Let's look at signals, let's look at loads and effectives. And we can think of those as an analogy in terms of a vehicle, with the mechanism being the engine, the external control mechanism being the fuel or air throttle, the accelerator in English parlance, and the measure of effectiveness then, the speed we get per unit of fuel. And that has direct parallels if we think of insulin as being similar to the throttle control on glucose metabolism. And glucose output then, measured by insulin concentration, is what we would mean by insulin sensitivity, or negatively insulin resistance. But note that if the liver hepatocyte isn't working, or the engine isn't working, this can appear abnormal, while actually the pathway of response can be normal. Indeed, if we overload that car, you will see that the speed of its vehicle, you can feel it, can't you, immediately is impaired. But does that imply there is insensitivity to the engine, to the fuel or throttle? The engine power may be perfectly normal. What the problem is the load we're putting on the system, and we're merely measuring the problem as its speed. It's not the speed which is the defect, it's actually the load put on the engine. So in equivalent terms, it may be that insulin insensitivity and insulin response is normal, but the liver hepatocyte itself is unable to function normally. Or perhaps, dare I say, it is responding normally, but responding normally to an abnormal load, i.e. that of calorie excess, substrate excess, if you like. So after decades of effort, supported by, $1 billion more of funding, there is no clear defect yet capable of explaining insulin resistance within the cellular signaling pathways or regulation of intercellular pathways. And this may be because they are essentially normal. So I want to ask, are the hepatic abnormalities of glucose output and uptake a physiological response, in fact, to the external stress, and what that stress might be? And I think we can reckon that we know the stress well enough. It's food, it's excess calories, whether it's liquid or solid, and it's laid down and manifest through central adiposity and liver fat. But that tells us what the stress is, not how it's actually manifesting itself, perhaps, to cause problems. We get misinterpretations as a result of all this, as well as talking about insulin sensitivity. Some people mistakenly talk about metformin as an insulin sensitizer. We know its primary mechanism of action is a gluconeogenesis, more lately worked out in terms of fatty acid transport and AMPK. We know it stimulates GLP-1 secretion. We know it has effects at the gut, but really it's not an insulin sensitizer. It's something which has more fundamental actions within the liver by inhibiting gluconeogenesis in particular. And accordingly, if you do a glucose clamp, you find the glucose requirements rise, and you misinterpret that as a better response to the insulin rather than a better response of the hepatocyte itself, because its metabolism is being regulated. By analogy then, if you beef up the car's engine and the throttle, then the response to the throttle will get better. Indeed, on my analogy of the car overloaded going up the hill, the car will actually move faster. And that leads you to the idea that the throttle response is better, but it's actually here the engine that's been improved. This has other consequences for our thinking. You will hear time and time again the words that insulin is caused by obesity. We know that is wrong. Insulin is not caused by obesity. And the key experiment here is one from my colleague Roy Taylor, Elin Lin, and others. And what they did is take people with typical type 2 diabetes, note the fasting hypoglycemia, and they put them on a low-calorie diet. And you will see that essentially fasting glucose normalizes within 1 week. That actually observation was made several decades ago in the US. So glucose metabolism actually normalizes within 7 days if you normalize calorie intake. And of course, you don't normalize obesity in 7 days. Body mass index, even at the end of 2 months, is still excessive. There's very small effect on obesity. So obesity is not the cause of type 2 diabetes, and nor, by the way, is liver fat. That does change more quickly. But you can see that at 1 week, you still got 10% hepatic triglyceride. Normal is, in fact, somewhere below 5%. So it's not liver fat either, which causes type 2 diabetes. Liver fat and body fat are correlates of glucose disorder. That is, they're co-caused. And of course, it's likely to be the high calorie intake that's co-causing the adiposity, whether peripheral or central, and the diabetes. Now, we have some other information if we think about how other drugs worked. I've referred to metformin already, but of course, the group of agents which cause the best persistence of glucose control are the thiazolidinedione. Even this difference is statistically significant. So thiazolidinediones actually give you, at 1 year anyway, as good control as metformin, as sulfonylureas, longer and better at 3 years. But there is a paradox, of course, because if you look at the weight gain, they cause continuous weight gain, here's rosiglitazone, over 3 to 5 years. So here is a group of drugs which we all call insulin sensitizers, and indeed clamps do improve insulin sensitivity, but paradoxically cause weight gain, again showing you that weight gain is not the cause of insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance, it's co-causation. Indeed, here, if we measure the insulin sensitivity, it's actually still improved. So we have the paradox of the PPAR gamma agents, that they cause weight gain and yet improve insulin sensitivity. And basically they do that because they stimulate peripheral adipogenesis, they decrease peripheral lipolysis, and make the obesity worse by moving the calories into the periphery away from the liver. So the liver no longer has to cope with the same excess calorie load as previously. You can see that happen. Look to the right here, free fatty acids. The one thing that both rosy and pyroglycosone do is drop free fatty acid concentrations. That is, they inhibit lipolysis peripherally, and they decrease the calorie load to the liver that's coming from peripheral fat, thereby improving insulin sensitivity. Peripheral insulin administration, and I emphasize peripheral to distinguish that from central insulin that you get with insulin secretion, also causes people to put on weight. And for the same reason, it promotes peripheral adipogenesis because the insulin is being given peripherally when you inject it. And again, you have this paradox that insulin improves insulin sensitivity here from 3 different studies, despite some weight gain. But that fits nicely again with the hypothesis that if you remove the calories from the center to the periphery, then you're going to improve the liver's function. And if you measure that as insulin sensitivity, it will improve. So let's look more detail about the liver and where these happenings. Now, of course, calories can come from food and drink intake in various forms. In fact, glucose, fructose, fat, alcohol, they can come from peripheral fat breakdown, and they can come from muscle glycogen stores acutely after meals as lactate and pyruvate. So the liver, in fact, gets its calories and therefore excess calories from various sources. And as we've seen that in therapeutic and other terms, we can improve that by decreasing intake, diet and anorectic mechanisms, by inhibiting peripheral fat breakdown with exogenous insulin or PPR gammas, or we can affect muscle glycogen stores by increasing physical exercise or decreasing carbohydrate intake. So all this makes sense in terms of the known mechanisms we have, and all improve insulin sensitivity and lead us to ask then, is type 2 diabetes then really just a response of the liver to high organ calorie load? So turning diabetes on its head, we have, as I've said earlier, the conventional view that diabetes develops when islet B cell function is unable to overcome the insulin sensitivity. A restatement of that view, that islet B cell function is unable to overcome insulin sensitivity at the liver, secondary to excess calorie intake. But perhaps better stated, that it develops as a result of biochemical mechanisms attempting to protect the liver, the hepatocyte, from the effects of excess substrate load, notably glucose, fructose, and fatty acids. So here are the excess calories arriving at the liver, coming in through glucose, fructose, fatty acids, and from muscle, the liver. And it can, of course, be converted to fatty acids and exported to fat. And some people will do that fat then being laid down peripherally as peripheral fat. So you get the female type of fat distribution associated with relatively good preservation of insulin sensitivity, while others actually accumulate the fat centrally, unable to export it, and cause problems with their intrahepatocyte metabolism. What then occurs, and I'm going to look at the mechanisms, is you then get a block to glucose uptake and increased glucose output from the liver, taking us back to where DeFronzo was earlier, and that, of course, is where the hyperglycemia comes from. So this slide looks horrific. It takes you back to medical school and biochemistry. But this is just glycolysis, gluconeogenesis. And importantly here, I have within the hepatocyte the circle indicating regulation of gluconeogenesis, glycolysis by mechanisms, nuclear mechanisms relating to gene expression. And the one I'm particularly interested here is the carbohydrate response proteins. And we're going to look in simplified fashion how that might be acting. If you have excess intake of carbohydrate, whether it comes from glucose or fructose, or indeed from other sources, then you will stimulate these responses. This is a very old mechanism. You can actually detect this mechanism in bacteria, and it's one of the related mechanisms by which bacteria switch between different food sources. So this is very fundamental biochemistry as far as cellular metabolism goes. But the effect of carbohydrate response protein is to affect two key enzymes. The glucokinase responsible for glucose uptake in the liver, which is effectively blocked, and glucose 6-phosphatase, which is responsible for glucose release from the liver, which is enhanced. So you can see now where the diabetes is coming from, a failure to uptake glucose into the liver because the liver is protecting itself against increased substrate load and promotion of glucose output through glucose 6P. And that may all be occurring for a different reason, and that is intracellular phosphate. All of us sitting here listening to me talking now, are dependent, of course, from phosphate-related mechanisms, ADP, ATP, as you know, and it's key to a whole load of intermediary metabolic steps. And disturbance of phosphate load may then be important as far as intracellular metabolism goes. Note this also accounts for the high uric acid levels you see in people with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. So we summarize that then as excess glucose and fructose load lead the liver to reduce glycolysis to protect itself from phosphate depletion. Glycogen overload, and glycogen's toxic, and fat overload and fat intermediates are toxic. So glucose instead is exported, as DeFronzo showed 3 decades ago, raising hepatic glucose production, thus causing diabetes. So just to restate that, then the emergent view would be diabetes develops as a result of biochemical mechanisms attempting to protect the hepatocyte from the effects of excess substrate load, not simply from insulin resistance, an artifact of the way we measure the situation. So just to finish then, if glucose is a protective mechanism, what are the consequences for glucose-lowering agents? Note that if we continue to overeat, the calories must go somewhere. That isn't biochemistry, that isn't chemistry even, that's simple physics. The calories must go somewhere. And the thiazolidinediones and peripheral insulin can help by pushing it to the periphery, as can reduce calorie intake from glucose GLP-1 receptor agonists, or of course by improving calorie balance using the SGLT2 drugs. But if we attack the problem the other way, say with sulfonylureas to increase endogenous insulin secretion, or we give a centrally acting insulin, hepatospecific insulin, or we use glucokinase activators, then the liver will actually push back against those drugs and limit their effectiveness. That's what happened with the GKAs. These were very effective drugs. Many of us thought they would be a wonderful new approach, short-acting, well-tolerated, big drop in plasma glucose. But what happened in 3 studies in type 2 diabetes, the efficacy simply disappeared. And it would have disappeared because the liver would be gradually, over the course of a month or 2, regulating against the effect of the drug, effectively negating it. And we see that as well with the sulfonylureas. So GKAs failed, and we now, I think, understand where they fail. If we think about what newer agents might do, we can predict that newer agents which do not affect calorie intake or calorie disposal will not have any greater efficacy than current oral agents. And this accounts why a whole load of mechanisms which have been looked at recently give no more effective glucose lowering than older mechanisms, whereas some of the GLP-1 RAs and insulin itself acting peripherally can do so. I hope that was useful to you. I thank you for your attention.